Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Raffaello Pantucci, and I'm delighted to invite you to join us for this latest webinar being run by ICPVTR at RSIS in Singapore, this time exploring the question of radicalization in Germany. I'm delighted today that we're having this second webinar, which is the second in a series that ICPVTR is running, trying to understand what is currently happening in terms of the terrorist threats in Europe. The aim of this series, which started a couple of months ago with a webinar by Ms. Suzanne Rain, former head of UK's JTAC, is to try to really understand, kind of in the round, the terrorist threats that is currently faced by Europe. As we've seen over the past few years, the terrorist threats that Europe faces have become much more complicated and much more diverse and diffuse. So from a terrorist threat that we used to sort of traditionally associate with one ideology and group, it's now spread into all sorts of different directions. Security leaders across Europe talk about the rising threat from the extreme right wing, as much as they still worry about the violent Islamist threat. And now they worry about conspiracy theorists and all sorts of other groups as well. And the nature of the attacks that we see has become incredibly complex. And we see overspill in all sorts of directions. And so to try to understand this better, at ICPVTR, we've decided to organize this webinar series, which tries to dig into some of these questions, taking a kind of case study approach for different European countries. And I'm really delighted today to welcome you to the second in this series, which is focusing on Germany. And we've given it the rather unimaginative title, I suppose, of Juggling Threats from All Sides, Germany's Complex Terrorist Picture. And the aim here, and we brought together experts, two top experts from Germany, Dr. Daniela Pisoju and Dr. Guido Steinberg, who are both very prominent German experts looking at terrorist threats in Germany and actually in Austria. I should emphasize that both of them are real experts on both countries. And both of them are each of them is in turn going to touch first on the violent Islamist threat and second, or other way around, sorry, first on the extreme right-wing threat, and then second up on the violent Islamist threat. I've asked each of them to start us off with about 15 minutes of comments, 15 to 20 minutes of comments to get us going, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. As is the practice with ICPVTR webinars, we prefer to do the Q&A function through the chat boxes. So if you do have any questions as you go along, feel free to plug them into the chat box, and I will pick them up at the end and then group them together and put them to our speakers, who I'm sure will be delighted to address all of your questions in great detail. Before I hand it over to our speakers to get us going, let me introduce them properly. I'm delighted that we're joined today by Dr. Daniela Pisoju, who is a senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, and is a widely published author covering a wide range of different issues, looking at the extreme right, but also Islamist threats, and also more generally at how Europe has managed its response to these terrorist problems. And she's going to touch on the extreme right wing in her presentation today. And then after that, we're going to have Dr. Guido Steinberg, who is a very prominent expert in Germany at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. And I apologize in advance for SWP colleagues for, I'm sure, butchering their name there. But Guido is a very prominent expert in Germany looking at the violent Islamist threat and has been deeply involved in managing this and acting as an expert witness in a number of trials. He also served in the German government back under, I think it was Chancellor Schröder, as an advisor on terrorist threats. And actually, he's just published a paper looking at the violent Islamist threat in Austria for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is being followed by one on Germany, I think, which is coming out imminently, which is part of a series that CAST is doing. So I think we'll try to share some links around that afterwards. But without further ado, let me hand it over to Daniela, who will start us off, and I think has got a PowerPoint to get us going. So Daniela, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm a big fan of Singapore. So I'm trying to go to the first slide. All right. So as it says here, I'm going to touch upon certain aspects of the right-wing extremist and terrorist threat in Germany. I'll give you a kind of an overview, but also insist on certain aspects which I think are particularly relevant, such as lone actors or the mainstreaming of the right-wing discourse in the mainstream politics. In terms of the dynamics between terrorism and counterterrorism, I was thinking about this question, and I think a good expression to describe is a cat and mouse game, right? So the state over the years has implemented a number of measures, and the actors have adapted to it in a very successful way, I might say. And one of the reasons for it is because for the longest time, this approach was very much repressive, not so much preventive, or in the sense of de-radicalization, and that has changed very recently, and with very recently, I mean some months ago. Although it's rather soon to pass a judgment on whether or not this is going to be successful, I think judging by the parallels to best practices around Europe, I think it is actually a very good program. But let's start with the beginning. Just to give you a quick background of my work, I've been working on, as was mentioned, also Islamist terrorism and terrorism in general. But recently, I've been focusing a lot more also on the right-wing extremism and terrorism, and also within the Voxpol network, which is an EU, a network of excellence project. I've been looking together with a colleague of mine from Hamburg, while still in Hamburg, of course, and also later at the extreme right wing, especially in Germany over time, and in particular online. So from this background, I'm just going to dive directly into the probably biggest scandal in this area of German history, which was the case of the so-called National Socialist Underground. This was a terrorist cell which was engaged in a number of assassinations and other kinds of attacks all over Germany, as you can see here on the map. And the outrage about it was, of course, that they have been doing this for a very, very long time without it even being identified as a terrorist threat. So there were a number of hypotheses of it being perhaps the doings of mafia or other kinds of things, because of course the victims were all migrants. So after this finally came to light, there was a big inquiry into whether or not perhaps the authorities, as they say in Germany, were blind in the right eye, right? Because obviously the main threat at the time was considered to be jihadi terrorism. But this case is also interesting from another point of view. So you can see here that the three protagonists, the three members of the cell, but they shouldn't be understood as something singular. So we talk very much nowadays about lone actors, about cells, but these actors always are embedded in certain structures. They have also a certain amount of support, but their development and their radicalization in time should also be understood in a particular context. So for example, in this case, there were the 90s where there were quite a few violent attacks against refugees. And this mobilization of the right wing against refugees, we will see also later in 2015. So this was the kind of context where the cell eventually emerged and went underground. The other aspect of the context is, as I was mentioning before, the cat and mouse game between the states. So before that, before this period, the state had cracked down on right-wing structures, but in terms of organization. So what the response was afterwards was to establish these comradeships, which are kind of loose networks, kind of organizations, but not official. So it was difficult for the law to really go after them. And this particular cell was also related to one of these comradeships, as it says here. So basically, this was one aspect of the dynamic. Another aspect of the dynamic was to say that the right-wing extremist actors and terrorist actors also over time sought to adapt in a different way. So not just going underground and organizing these attacks and becoming violent, but also adapting, changing, modernizing, in a sense, becoming undercover, being out there in the open, but making it difficult for them to be recognized and prosecuted as terrorists or right-wing extremists. And I'm going to give you some examples here. For example, these are the so-called Autonomous Nationalists. They were very popular until about 2010 and a little bit later. But this is an example to show how the scene has managed to adapt, for example, in this case, by copying very much the left-wing extremists in the way in which they are dressed. You can see the black clothes, but also symbols, such, for example, the scarf, which was typical for the left-wing scene, the Palestinian scarf. They also copied, for example, ways of protesting, the so-called Black Bloc, which again came from the left-wing autonomous scene. And overall, it made it very difficult, even in practical terms, for police to recognize them, to know which is which, you know, if it was a kind of a demonstration or not. But the most important thing is here, the way in which this new appearance, this modern kind of mainstream almost appearance, made them more attractive to young people. This also was illustrating the choice of music, for example. So not this right-wing rock, which was typical for the scene before, but also going into things like hip hop and rap. Therefore, really going out there for the young people in the mainstream. Another example is the Identitarians. Now, these this is a movement which can be found also in other countries, of course, in Austria, but also in France. And this is another example of becoming modern on the outside, not on the inside. So very importantly, the ideology has not changed very much, but the presentation towards the outside. Also here we can see copycat instances, such as, for example, this on the right-hand side, you can see "You shall not pass." This comes again from the right-wing scene, in that case referring to fascists, but in this case they refer to migrants. Because of course the main agenda point of this movement is stopping refugees and migrants from coming to Europe. For the Identitarians, 2015 and the so-called migration crisis gave them a very big boost. So you can see how the refugees and the migration topic comes again and being picked up by right-wing actors and who are trying to capitalize on it. Another important aspect that relates to this movement is the change in discourse. And this is again a movement of adaptation. They are not talking about race, but about culture, right? So away from the vocabulary of the Nazi time that referred to races, they talk about cultures, but in fact, in the end, and basically, it is the same message. So the message is we need to stop the so-called, how they call the great replacement. So the idea of other kinds of people coming to our country, to our nation, and trying to replace the population. So that stop den großen Austausch, that means stop the great replacement. Now this, in this kind of formulation, was not initially recognized as right-wing extremist by the mainstream or by the mainstream politics, in spite of experts arguing to the contrary. And even more than that, this kind of discourse slowly penetrated the mainstream political discourse as well. Or things like Festung Europa, which means citadel, Europe, fortress Europe, which you can also see and hear in some of the main the discourse of the main political parties, especially on the right. Here I wanted to present you some latest numbers on what are we actually talking about, what are the dynamics, quantitative dynamics in the right-wing extremist and terrorist scene in Germany. This is the report of the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. This is basically the agency of internal intelligence, as it were. You can see on the bottom left, there are quite a few structures, especially also parties, which are observed by this office. Importantly, also parts of a political party which is actually quite successful and is has obtained, for example, one of the Länder 20% of votes, and this is the Alternative for Germany. Alternative for Germany currently has about 11%, I've checked, overall, but in certain parts of the country it has a lot more. And this is one of the actors that again bring some of these extreme right topics in the mainstream discourse, in the mainstream politics, and makes them, as it were, that normalizes them. As you can see here, part of it is already under surveillance or under observation by this office. Overall, we can see that 13,000 basically means that these are this is the overall number of individuals who are potentially violent. And the message here is that the number has increased since last year. The other charts show you on the top left corner violent acts over the years, and you can see criminal acts and violent acts over the years, and you can see it's kind of a constant here. But where we can see also in the top left, in the bottom left corner, is that the number of people who are potentially violent has actually increased. So this is definitely not good news. I wanted to also draw your attention towards an article in the report that we wrote about these kinds of movement that I've been showing you so far. So the Autonomous Nationalists, the Identitarians, and the Alternative for Germany, who usually are put in different categories. So one talks about neo-Nazis, the so-called new right, so the ones with a new discourse on cultures instead of races. And then Alternative for Germany, which is usually categorized as a populist right-wing party. What we did in this article and by looking at their messages on Twitter was to show that their core message was actually the same. In fact, some of them have even started to use words from the former historical National Socialist vocabulary. What is even more, their tactics towards attracting people have become very sophisticated, not just in terms of how professional the videos and the messages are, but also in terms of using emotions, hyperboles, things that basically you can see here. So these are not the worst. I mean, the worst we haven't actually published, but this is to show how by showing images and how basically you see it, for example, bottom right, there's masses of refugees. So basically trying to instill fear in people that what we're looking at is an invasion of people from other countries. So working very much with this kind of emotional tool. Also, if you can, what you can see on top is how the discourse has very much focused on Islam. So of course, individuals being foreigners and immigrants as such is bad enough, yeah, for them. But Islam and Islamist terrorism has also been instrumentalized and capitalized upon to paint this picture of threat. It says Europe belongs to us. So basically, you have all these Islamists, all these terrorists coming and conquering Europe. And this is, for example, a message. A banner, a poster of the party Alternative for Germany. So we're not talking about here neo-Nazis or other kinds. What it also says here, for example, Islam does not belong to Germany. So you can see how this kind of messages have managed to reach the mainstream and be presented without a fear of being sanctioned in any way. And then the other one that I'm showing is from the neo-Nazi kind of part, but the idea is to show that their message is actually going in the same direction. Here they're talking about Überfremdung, so basically that refers to the infiltration of the German people and nation by others, and Überfremdung is, as I say, a word that was used historically in the National Socialist times. What they also do is to support the Alternative for Germany against the others who are pictured as being part of this conspiracy, left-wing globalist conspiracy that is orchestrating all these mass movements towards Europe. So another element here, again, the conspiratorial thinking of a small group of individuals who are orchestrating basically all this evil coming to Germany. And of course, historically, it was the Jews, but nowadays it's the Jews and others and the left, and it's a little bit more complex. But the main structure of the thinking has remained the same. And now I wanted to go a little bit into more recent types of violent attacks and the lone actor attacks that we've been witnessing in the last couple of years, which again have very much shocked the society and I guess parts of the politics as well. This is, for example, the assassination of a politician. It's actually a conservative politician who was in favor of receiving refugees to Germany. And the interesting part is that the attacker is not the typical lone wolf that we maybe know from the jihadi part of things, but a person who was very much integrated. He was married, he had 2 children, he was working, but he was very much he was very much a product of the extreme right scene and structures. So he was embedded, as it says here, in various political parties, also in criminal subcultures, comradeships, and he had a record. So he had already been arrested and condemned for attacks, physical attacks also against foreigners and asylum seekers. And his motive was to preserve the ethnic and cultural homogeneity of the people by preventing asylum seekers from coming to Germany. So we see again the same message over and over again. Also importantly, before this thing happened, there was a whole campaign, actually a second campaign against this politician online, where there were calls to kill him. He was declared as a traitor and so forth. And I just wanted to also put the idea of Pegida. Pegida is a yet another section of the scene, usually categorized as populist. They're called patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the West. And from this corner, there was also calls and criticisms against this politician. So my message here is to say, yes, there are these lone actors doing this individual action, but this doesn't come out of the blue, but is the product of a certain context, of a certain dynamic. And it should be seen as a tip of the iceberg, really. So this is basically, I call it hardcore because it's really direct product of organically grown within the scene, but you also have other kinds of lone actor attacks which happened later. These individuals were not necessarily embedded in structures, but they were very much socialized within a certain discourse. Right. So this is a case of, I call them losers because I had an article on jihadi lone attacker losers. But here is to say that basically this individual had various kinds of personal problems, but that is less relevant as the fact that he was already socialized, as I say, in this discourse, also produced by the AfD. By the way, AfD had in this particular region 20% of the elections of the votes in 2018. And he was very much embedded into this discourse of foreigners, they come here, they rape our women, etc. And the people that reporters talked to afterwards, they had this kind of discourse, we're not xenophobic, but, right? So there are already also within his social environment certain ideas that were basically against asylum seekers and refugees. Another example, this is interesting because this was a copycat of the Christchurch attack. So this individual wanted to film himself and organize a live stream on Twitch. He wanted to attack a synagogue, but didn't manage, and then he killed some other people outside. Again, this is the kind of the loser type who didn't really have a life, didn't have a job, a girlfriend, and so forth. But he was very much socialized again in this conspiratorial discourse online. He also made the weapon himself, also from the online instructions. And finally, the third example I wanted to give in this category, this is again an individual that was rather failure, one could say, in his personal life. Didn't have a girlfriend, that's what he said himself in his manifesto. But he was also one of the individuals who very much socialized online in the discourse of conspiracy theories, but also the idea of degeneration of the people. So basically these arguments of trying to prevent foreigners, people of other natures, whatever that is, from destroying the German nation. Yeah. So, and also interestingly, I thought he was also into these conspiracies. It was even before QAnon, right? At least before QAnon came to Germany. He was also into conspiracies, conspiracy theories, talking about the victimization of children in the underground. So you see how in the individual case, sometimes, especially in this online world, and I expect this to continue later, how various kinds of elements from various kinds of ideologies combine to create a logical, for that person, logical a narrative of what's going on and requiring action. At the same time, the fact that the main message and the main problem they're trying to fight is actually the same, right? So the dying, the disappearance of the German nation. Finally, I think I'm over time. I just wanted to quickly also touch upon other issues. What I call structural right-wing extremism. So the fact that recently there have been quite a few investigations and scandals relating to the infiltration of certain security structures by right-wing extremists. This has been going on for actually a very long time. It has just come to light recently through various cases. So we're talking about police, but also the Office of the Protection of the Constitution, but also military structures, in particular a special unit called KSK, Kommando Spezialkräfte, where recently there was actually a documentary as well. There was an actual attempt, or the actual preparation for a coup attempt against the government by various military individuals. Of course, it wouldn't have succeeded, but still the fact that they were preparing this is significant. And Tag X basically refers to the day X. So the day X is the day where the government is going to be overthrown. And this is something that not just these particular individuals have been preparing for, but generally right-wing extremist individuals who have gone after, who are in a particular radicalization stage already. So I myself talked to quite a few who were also back in the day preparing for the Tag X. This is just a few numbers, for example, from the army, where it says that I just made a quotation in German original, not to make any mistakes. So, for example, just in 2020, there were over 1,000 investigations into possible right-wing extremist individuals within the army. And you can see over 800, the majority were of right-wing extremist kind. So, and now finally, we're getting back to the state response. This, as I say, is a very recent program. It contains over 90 measures. And in my opinion, it's actually quite a good one because it's really whole of state, whole of society. So it's not just about, okay, we have to go after commercial, we have to go after individuals, we have to put people to prison. But the question is, how can we address this issue in various sectors of society, various sectors of the state? So you have there listed all sorts of ministries, all sorts of other civil society actors, research. So it's a very broad net that they're trying to throw. And it's finally, I think, in my opinion, a recognition of the fact that this phenomenon is not related to individuals, but really it's planted all over society. So you really have to act at various kinds of points in the whole of society, whole of the state. So you have things like adult education, political education, measures for police, things to strengthen social cohesion, youth programs. They're also looking at the online sphere, the internet, how to combat racism online, legislation against death lists. So our first victim was on such a death list, culture integration and so forth. So you can see it's actually a very broad kind of program. And at the end, I mean, this Q is for questions, but it also refers to QAnon. I didn't have much time to talk about it in particular, but just this short sentence, QAnon is definitely something that is also happening in Germany. And it's something that interacts very successfully with the rest of the right-wing discourse. And the same for another Q, the so-called Querdenker, so the cross thinkers, which is yet another movement that has emerged as a protest against the measures against Corona. And again, from that particular point, they're also moving towards and also interact very well with the right-wing extremism thought. So what we have at the moment is basically an existing scene which has reinvented itself and has become actually bigger rather than smaller. And on top of that, these new influences on the one hand from the US with the QAnon movement, and also this new COVID-related movement, which basically blows this thing even more out of proportion. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Daniela. Really a comprehensive overview of the extreme right in Germany, and you know, touching on the kind of mainstream elements and these sort of fringe elements, and I think the lone actor methodology, and then finally a bit on the government at the end. So thank you very much for that. So if you have any questions specific about that, please do feel free to feed them into the chat function now. But before I get to them, I'm delighted to turn it instead over to Dr. Guido Steinberg, who's going to talk us through the same sort of questions, but from the violent Islamist side of the coin instead. So Guido, over to you. Guido, you're on mute, unfortunately.
Same mistake every week. Good morning to everybody from Berlin. I hope you are all well, and many thanks to Raffaello and the Institute in Singapore for the invitation. I'll talk about 5 points. First, an overview of the jihadist scene in Germany nowadays. Secondly, my interpretation of the causes for the rise of Islamist terrorism in the country. Third, a short overview over the Germans in Syria between 2012 and 2021. Fourth, IS, Islamic State activity in Germany, especially between 2014 and today. And fifth, government responses, plus some trends that I think are important to take a look at for the future of the jihadist movement in Germany. So my first point, the jihadist scene in Germany, and this is mainly about numbers. We are talking about a jihadist scene that is considerably smaller than the right-wing extremist scene. We are talking about 1,000 to 2,000 persons, or if you want to take a look at a number that is more concrete, we are talking about a little bit more than 1,000 persons, among them 20% women who went to Syria between 2012 and 2021. And this is substantially more than 10 or 15 years ago. And that is something one has to explain. Germany has been a backwater of European jihadism until about 2010. And I think the most important cause was that recruitment, jihadist recruitment and mobilization was by and large a phenomenon of Arabs and Arab origin Europeans and some Pakistanis. And that is one of the reasons why France, Belgium, the Netherlands to some extent, and Britain were more important jihadist theaters in Europe until about 2010. And that has changed, especially when you compare the number of people who went to Syria, where the French, of course, field the highest numbers with up to 2,000, but then come the Germans with about 1,000, then the Brits with, I think, 800 or 900. And I think the most important reason for this change here in Germany has been that jihadist terrorism from 2010 or even a little bit earlier has begun to attract other nationalities, other ethnic communities, most importantly for Germany, the Turks and the Kurds. You might know that we have about 2,500 people of Turkish and Turkish Kurdish origin here in the country, and that was until 2015 the dominating Muslim immigrant community in the country. And ever since these people have become the subject of or have become prone to jihadist radicalization, Germany has a bigger problem. But we're not talking about only talking about Turks and Kurds. We do see a major mobilization in recent years, of Albanians, Bosnians, some Chechens who have entered the country recently, and that's always a big problem in Germany, converts. My second point, the causes. Many of these people that we talk about, of these up to 2,000 jihadists, come from the poor immigrant quarters of the big cities, namely Berlin, Hamburg, Frankfurt and the area, Bonn, Cologne, and the Ruhr region. And that might hint at the importance of socioeconomic reasons for the upsurge in jihadist mobilization. But the problem is there is no single socioeconomic profile. There are students among those who left the country in recent years, some of them quite well educated, many of them without any obvious socioeconomic problems. And I think that this must lead us to the conclusion that the only common denominator that we see is jihadist ideology. And there are a lot of hints as to the evidence of the ideological factor for the emergence and the upsurge of the German jihadist scene. You could see that, for example, in mid-2014, when the Islamic State organization started attracting increasing numbers of Germans. I had the chance to talk to some who returned, I had the chance to some who stayed, but all of them said that the emergence of a Salafist Islamic State on the basis of what they consider to be Sharia law was such an important event in the history of Islamism in Germany that it changed everything for them. The second hint as to the importance of the ideological factor is that most cases that have of jihadists, most important cases of jihadists here in Germany popped up after people got into contact with charismatic preachers, and charismatic preachers have been a problem on the rise in the country ever since 2005. Just to give you one example, which is not a German one, but an Austrian one, there was a guy called Mirzad Omerovic who was recruiting for the Islamic State organization in Austria until late 2014. And he was incredibly successful. He recruited dozens of Austrians and many Germans to the cause of IS. And when he was arrested in late 2014, jihadist mobilization and travels to Syria in his surroundings stopped completely. And we've got similar phenomena in Germany, namely jihadist preachers of considerable importance. My third point, the Germans in Syria. I have said that we talk about 1,070 persons who went to Syria between 2012 and 2021. In fact, travel movements stopped in 2018, and about 80 to 90% of these people joined the Islamic State. Why did they do so? I already said they did join this organization in particular, although they had the choice. There were other jihadist organizations, because it was, as they would have it, a Sharia-oriented organization, an organization that wants an Islamic State right now with no compromise whatsoever. Quite in contrast to more pragmatic Al-Qaeda-oriented organizations like the Nusra Front or the Syria Liberation Committee, HTS, as the Nusra Front calls itself today. The Islamic State had an enormous success in attracting Germans to its ranks. The numbers rose, as I have already said, considerably in the second half of 2014, and Germans popped up in all parts of the organization. So if you want to take a closer look at the structures, you will find Germans, for example, in the ISIS secret police called Al-Aman, Arabic for security, or Al-Amniyat. You have Germans in the Hisba, the religious police. There are even German women who fought in the Katiba Nusayba, the all-female fighting unit in Islamic State, and so on. But what is interesting to see is that Germans, and I think that's due in part to their ethnic origins, did usually not play any major roles in the organization, meaning that they did not rise in the ranks of the organization, except in a few cases where the Germans were in fact of Arab origin. We do have the most prominent German in the organization. It was a German Egyptian, Reda Seyam. Those of you who are interested in the history of jihadist terrorism in South Asia might remember him. He was apprehended in 2002 in Indonesia because he was suspected to have taken a part in the Bali bombings, but he was rescued quite ironically from nowadays point of view. He was rescued by the German police and brought to Germany so that he would not be subject to a US rendition. Anyhow, Reda Seyam was the Minister of Education for the Islamic State in Mosul and the highest ranking official in the organization. A second person who held a certain rank was Mohammed Mahmoud. He was the leader of the German contingent in Syria for quite a while. Again, ironically, he was an Austrian, but an Austrian who had moved to Germany, who, in order to become the leader of a radical movement, I wouldn't talk about historical parallels here, but he has been quite an important personality in the history of the organization and of German jihadism. Both of them are dead, and I would argue that both were able to play a major role in the organization, not because they were Germans, but rather because they were Arabs in an organization that was for a long time dominated by Iraqis, then by Iraqis, Syrians, and Arabs. It was by and large harder for non-Arab Germans, Turks, Albanians, Bosnians, and so on to rise in the ranks of the organization. So the travels of Germans to Syria did have repercussions in Germany, and that's my fourth point. IS planned to perpetrate attacks in Europe and Germany from late 2013, and the first German who was sent back from Syria in order to build structures in Germany was sent back in May 2014. There were others, but to no avail. All those who were sent back from Syria to Germany were arrested before they could perpetrate attacks. The first successes for the organization in Germany came in 2016, and that mainly through remotely directed attacks. And that's the major IS innovation in terrorist tactics, and the only way that the organization could realize successes here in the country. Directed attacks means that the perpetrators have not been to Syria, not been to Iraq. They were only in contact with the organization via social media, and they had coaches, handlers, who explained them how to perpetrate attacks successfully, although in the planning or in the organization and of the attack, they were on their own. Interestingly, among those attacks that were perpetrated in 2006, there were no jihadist returnees from Syria, but very young Germans who did not manage to reach Syria. They perpetrated attacks, but luckily they didn't kill anyone. And secondly, by refugees who came to Germany between 2014 and 2016 only, from Syria, Tunisia, and a guy from Pashtunistan. We don't know until today whether he was a Pakistani or an Afghan. And the high point of this development was the attack here in Berlin in December 2016, perpetrated by the Tunisian Anis Amri, who had been in contact with an IS handler for a couple of months already, and this probably prompted him to steal a truck before the attack and use the truck as a weapon in order to attack a Christmas market. My fifth point are government responses. And surprisingly, government responses have been few. And I think the main reason is the dysfunctionality of the German grand coalitions of the Merkel era. You might know that grand coalitions between the conservative CDU and the left of center Social Democrats have ruled the country between 2005 and 2009, and again since 2013 until 2021. And these governments have been highly divided on security issues, especially in recent years, with the CDU, the Merkel party, moving to the right and the Social Democrats moving to the left. And that means that hardly anything meaningful was done in the fight against Islamist terrorism by the federal government. And that's quite surprising because the weaknesses of the German security architecture are not hard to find. It is first highly fragmented. We do have about 38 security authorities in the country fighting terrorism in general. That is due to the federal structure of the state. We have one state police authority. We have in each of the 16 states and so on. Secondly, counterterrorism in Germany is a highly bureaucratic undertaking. Bureaucratic inertia is not only a problem during the pandemic, but also in counterterrorism. And there is a lack of core abilities, especially in telecommunications surveillance. The result is that we remain highly dependent on the US, and that was quite a problem in 2016 when US security authorities were not able to track the communications between IS supporters here in the country and Syria for quite a while, and this resulted in attacks. Instead, though, we have seen the government acting in more informal ways with the security-minded parts of the government, namely the Interior Ministry or the interior ministries of the states, focused on two policies. First, the Germans are or have been deporting as many potential jihadists as possible to their countries of origin. That means people who have been born in the country, perhaps, are being sent back to Turkey if there is a chance to do so. And Germany has intensified this policy in a dramatic way. Just to give you one example, Germany is not only sending people back to Turkey, to Algeria, to Iraq, but also it is sending back Chechen jihadists to Russia. I have to confess, I'm quite a hardliner in security matters, but that is going, even by my standards, is going a little bit too far. And secondly, the German government has put dozens of Syrian Islamist groups on our terrorism list. I mean, most people would not know more than 2 or 3 Syrian jihadist groups operating in Syria. The German government has put about 20 of these groups on its terrorism list in order to incarcerate as many Syrians who carried a weapon against the Assad government as possible in recent years. And my sixth point, as I promised, are short, are 2 trends that I would like to mention. First, of course, counterterrorism in Germany still works, simply because we do have huge institutions. They are slow, they are sometimes inept, but parts of them do their work. Most importantly, though, US information is flowing, and German authorities have thwarted major plots in recent years. What is worrying me and many others in the German security community are 3 aspects. First, the numbers of Germans who remain in Syria. We do, of course, talk about those who are in the jails of the Syrian PKK and under the control of the Americans. We're talking about nearly 30 males and about 70 to 80 women. Not a major problem. There might be a political problem because the government doesn't want them back, but they are not a security problem for the time being. But more importantly, there are still about 40 Germans fighting with HTS, namely the Syria Liberation Committee, the successor organization to the Nusra Front in Idlib, and they are fighting for other jihadist organizations over there as well. And 40 is a number considerably higher than the number of jihadists that we knew about abroad in Pakistan in 2010 and 2011, for example. So there is still a jihadi community in Syria that might be able to come back to Germany in the coming years. Secondly, and that's a problem that is connected to the presence of HTS and Germans in HTS in Syria, that's the lack of interest in effective counterterrorism in the neighboring country, Turkey. And every security problem that pops up in Turkey is a security problem in Germany as well, if only because of the travel movements between the country and the huge number of Turkish and Kurdish origin Germans here in the country. And thirdly, what is worrying me in recent months is the increased activity on the part of IS affiliates. We have especially seen an interest by IS personnel in Afghanistan in contacts with European jihadists, especially here in Germany in recent years. And at the same time, there is an interest by IS supporters here in Germany to join the affiliates. Some Germans have tried to go to Afghanistan. One has managed to reach the Philippines. Others have tried to go to Libya and to Egypt. It's not a big problem simply because it has been so hard to travel in recent years, but it is a problem that people are still interested in joining IS. So that we do, and here I would go back to what Raffaello said in the introduction. We do have a threat picture that even if you only take a look at the jihadist scene here in Germany, that is a lot more diverse than it was years before, plus left-wing, plus right-wing extremism. So the threat, I think, is bigger in Germany. The overall terrorism threat in Germany is bigger than it was in recent years. Thank you very much.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Guido, for really an equally comprehensive overview of the threat picture from the violent Islamist side. And I think the details that you pulled out about the various cases, the links that we see with Syria, the persistence of these problems, even bringing it right up to date, talking about the links that we're still seeing with Afghanistan, I think is really interesting and really important detail to highlight. I also thought your point about Turkey was really interesting as well, and highlighting the kind of interconnectedness of these problems. And maybe to get us going on the questions, I want to fire a question at both of you. And then I see we've already accumulated a whole bunch of really interesting questions in the chat function. And so what I'll do is I'll first put a question to both of you, which I'll ask you, Daniela first, and then Guido to respond to. And while I sort of feel through the others, and I'll sort of filter them, see if I can cluster them a little bit so we can cover them in the time that we have left. And the question I wanted to pick up was, as I say, picking up on this point, Guido, you were sort of ending with talking about the threats in Germany and how, you know, a problem in Germany is going to become a problem in Turkey, sorry, is going to become a problem in Germany because of the interconnectedness. And to ask you both to talk a little bit more about the interconnectedness of the threats that you're looking at within Germany with the broader European communities that we're talking about. Now, I think if I can be bold, I'll say Austria as a given. You both highlighted that Austrian links are very tight. The fact that Daniela is joining us talking about Austria. Guido's just written a wonderful paper about Austrian jihadism. You know, I think we could take it as a given that Austria is is interconnected with the German problems. But I wonder if you could cast the net a little wider. How do you see the kind of extreme right-wing threat in Germany and Austria interconnected with the other groups that we see around kind of Europe, and similarly with the jihadist networks that you talked about, Guido. You mentioned how they were linked up with ISIS, how some of them rose up the ranks, but not that many. But how are they connected on the ground across Europe? So let's start off with that question, and then I'll start to go through some of the other questions and group them together a bit. So Daniela, over to you, please, first.
Yeah, so it might seem, how to say, counterintuitive to say that that right-wing extremists are connected to others because their agenda is very much nationalistic in a sense. But indeed, there are many kinds of interconnections. So starting with participating at events together, whether it is demonstrations or concerts, or of course, this has become a bit less during the pandemic, but it has become more online. I think an important point is also this new spin that the ideology has. So looking at culture rather than race, because that allows them to say, well, we're talking about the Western culture, the European culture, as opposed to these other cultures. So yet another building block to say, we fight together, you as French, us as Germans and others and Belgians or whatever. We are fighting each other for our own kind of country, but together against these external influences. So this is one of the things. The other thing is, of course, now, especially with QAnon, but also before, and I dare say this has been somewhat intensified through the pandemic and through the fact that there's more exchange online, that people are more online, that these, I mean, we've seen these kind of exchanges before, but it has become a lot more intense now. And if I may, just to pick it up, because I saw somebody ask something about QAnon and how is that different in Germany? Well, what happens is basically, and with the politics, it's a bit like in movies, right? Like we take American movies and give them a spin, and then the German version. So basically, in this case, is that the QAnon story taken as such with an additional spin. So the stories about the children have been, for example, taken up by this very famous musician, Xavier Naidoo, talking about the victimization of children and pedophiles and so forth. But also the other story about, for example, Trump fighting the deep state in the US and all these measures basically being there in place for him to rescue America against the deep state. And the spin is to say, well, Germany is still occupied by Allied forces, and the hope is that Trump will come and help us out to liberate from this occupation. So the story was basically adopted and twisted to their own kind of purposes. But there's different kind of, it's also, QAnon individuals and symbols showing up, for example, at demonstrations against COVID measures. So it's a little bit all over the place, also in terms of merchandise being sold or influencers disseminating further QAnon ideas, but kind of undercover. So it really, at different kind of points in the scene, it has grown roots.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Daniela. And touching on some QAnon, which I think addresses some of the questions that were raised. Guido, over to you.
Well, every one of these wars or jihads in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Syria, and so on, leads to more transnational cooperation, I would argue. It has been the case in every conflict. It leads to mobilization first of jihadists, and then to increasing cooperation across borders. It is hard to say to what extent Syria will play such a role until now, simply because the important people that we talk about, Mahmoud, Sayyam, and so on, those who have been leaders in the community are mostly dead. There are some important personalities who remain stuck in PKK jails, and nobody knows what is going to happen to them. So I'm not sure how this will work out. What is obvious, though, is that Turkey is a place where these people can still survive, and especially those who are of Turkish origin have no problems whatsoever. We've got a whole bunch of German jihadists, and I think from Austria as well, who are living in Turkey. So I don't know. I think it's a little bit too early to say what the influence of the Syrian jihad will be in the future. By and large, we are still talking about national communities, national jihadist communities, but what I've been taking a closer look at in recent months are transnational networks overlapping these or crossing the borders. And there are some important developments. We have seen the cooperation, for example, of Moroccans and other North Africans between France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and West Germany, if I may say so. So the area between Cologne, Bonn, Frankfurt, where most of the German North Africans live. There are not so many here in Berlin. That's a phenomenon that we have known for, I would say, 15, 16 years already, although the Algerians were more prominent in the early days than today. Today, it's by and large a Moroccan and Tunisian jihadist scene. What has been more important in recent years are Turkish and Bosnian networks. And I take a very close look in recent months at one of them, and that's the network of a guy called Ebu Hanzala. Ebu Hanzala, his real name is Halis Bayanjuk. I think he's currently in jail in Ankara. He's sometimes in jail, sometimes he's out, because even for the Turkish government, he's too radical. And he is extremely active in building an ideological network across borders all over Europe. You will find his supporters in Austria, with tremendous influence on jihadist circles over there, including the guy who perpetrated the attack on November 2, 2020 in Vienna. He is extremely active here in Germany, and obviously these people are trying to build organizations across borders. And there are similar phenomena among Bosnians in Austria, in Bosnia, and in Germany, and among Albanians in Macedonia. Now, I think we have to say North Macedonia in order not to piss off the Greeks. North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, Austria, again, and southern Germany. So the jihadist scene, I think, here in Europe is losing some of its, well, national characteristics, and these networks are taking over. The problem is that it is so hard to do research on them in Turkey. It seems to be the hub of many of them in recent years and in recent months, especially after IS disappeared from the scene, at least as a territorial actor in Syria and Iraq.
Thank you both for that. Some really interesting points. And I think, I suppose one of the things about the foreign battlefields question is, how long do we have to wait before plots actually appear? And maybe our expectation is it should happen immediately and it takes longer. And I often wonder if that's maybe part of it. But I think the points about Turkey that you made are really interesting. And I think it's going to be the hub of a lot of problems going forward, in much the same way as QAnon, I think, is going to be the source of a lot of problems for a very long time going forwards as well. We've got a whole range of questions, and a lot of them have been targeted at kind of one or the other of you. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to pair them off against each other. And so first I want to ask Daniela, the first two questions that came up. One was asking to talk a little bit about the cultural integration aspect as part of the state response, and how is that being carried out, and what is the response from the targeted community? And maybe wrapping into that, the second question, which is kind of a more existential question about German politics, about, is the rise of the right wing a rejection of the German conservative CDU government that Chancellor Merkel has been advocating? So if you have kind of any thoughts on that, and then Guido, afterwards, I'll ask you to maybe cover a question that Kumar has asked, which is looking at, is there a systematic attempt to devise a counter-ideological narrative against the violent Islamist ideology? You talked a little bit about the expulsions of people as a kind of practical measure. I wanted the counter-narrative side. I think these two questions kind of pair off against each other, if you will. So we'll go with that. So Daniela, over to you first, and then Guido.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I have to say something about how integration is being framed in the first place. And also because this is so much different to the way it's being framed in Austria. Integration is seen not as, migrants having to adapt, or to be assimilated in some way into the mainstream culture, because this is what we hear mostly here from the government, at least the federal one. But it's about something that concerns the whole of society. And when they say integration, they also mean, for example, fighting racism and integrating migrants in the structures of the state. If it's, for example, police, so integration is very much about having equal rights and participation. And I want to, if I may, very quickly, just share this. So these are the measures that I mentioned. So there are 89 measures, a lot of measures. They're planned for 2021 until 2024. And there's been already a kind of a summary meeting the end of the first quarter. But here, just to show you a couple of examples, of course, it's in German. For example, this is öffentliche Dienst. It means basically public service. So how can we have more people with who are migrants in the public service? Diversity measures, or what else do we have? Just marked it before. Integration measures, for example, in sports, to have more projects in this kind of area. Civil organization, cooperation with civil society organizations run by migrants. Integration through qualification. So this is very important. And we've seen also, if we look at, the other extreme, or what actually works in terms of preventing violence. And this is not just for migrants, but also in general, having work and working with other people of different backgrounds actually helps very much in terms of social cohesion. And there's quite a few fighting against anti-Semitism, for example. Researching victimization experiences of individuals with migration background. And this is, you need to know a little bit of a context, because for the longest time, as I said, there was this case of the NSU where you had all these people with migration background who were victims of right-wing violence, and they were never seen as such. So the official story was, well, it's probably some kind of underground mafia wars. So, and that's why these things become now very important. And I think it's good that we have this very extensive catalog of measures, especially since in Austria we don't. So, and I think it's important to also show the good parts. Of course, there were many mistakes in the way that this case was handled, but there were, I think the response is actually quite good. There was the second question was about rejecting Christian democratic values. Well, as you might know, in Germany, there's two the Christian democratic parties. There's a one in Bavaria and the rest of Germany. And they do not necessarily agree on certain issues, especially concerning migrants and refugees and such. So the one in Bavaria is known to be more of a hardliner in this respect. Now, of course, the policy of Angela Merkel was very much criticized, especially as during the refugee crisis, her position was, well, we have to deal with it now, or I think what she said is, wir schaffen das, we can do it. And also her approval rates kind of dropped after a while, but then they went up again. So I think the popularity of the right-wing discourse, of the right-wing ideas is only, the critique towards mainstream politics has, I think, only a very small role to play. These ideas have been there for the longest time, and these right-wing actors are very skillful in formulating messages that reach people. And it works, and it works again. Very, very simple messages such as, well, you know, refugees come here and they don't do anything and they just get money and mobile phones and such. And you have to be there and work for it. You know, these kind of very simple messages can reach certain people, and they do it over and over again. And then, of course, there's a discussion, as was said before, Western Germany and Eastern Germany, and the fact that in the East, of course, this kind of things are somewhat more popular. Also, the AfD is more popular. Then it has to do a lot with also the past and perhaps a little bit of resentment towards the West. So it's very complex. I think one needs to look at various facets, but the most important thing, in my opinion, is the actual agency of these right-wing actors. This is the kind of thing that we have to focus on. And as was mentioned also before, how do we counteract this? Because formulating messages and counter narratives, I think, very, very important. Because as you can see, the discourse reaches very deep, especially online.
Thank you for that, Daniela. I think you've teed it up perfectly for Guido to tell us a bit about the counter narrative side on the Islamist side of the coin. Please, Guido, over to you.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is none. And I think part of the reason is that politicians, journalists, academics wouldn't agree on the diagnosis. We've got a left of center camp who will focus the importance of socioeconomic issues, prevention, and so on. And we've got a right of center camp that I usually don't belong to, but in this case I do, focusing on the ideology of the movement. And at the same time, demanding hard security measures first. And this situation has led to the phenomenon that we can't even talk about counter narratives, because an important part of the political spectrum doesn't even believe in counter narratives. At the same time, I would argue we have so many problems as a
Guido, are you?
Connection lines,
they
spectrum, yes?
So you just, I think, at least for me, I think you just very quickly cut off, I think, by the quizzical look on Daniela's face. I think it was one of those two. If you maybe repeat your last point, just the absolute last one you mentioned, because I think we just lost you for a second there.
And well, it's a personal point. We've got so many problems with ourselves, with our place in the world, in the European Union. The changes in our party system with the rise of right-wing extremists or right-wing populists, with the virtual disappearance of social democracy, the move of the conservatives towards the left, and so on. I do not think that we are ready to find common ground for a counter narrative. That's part of the reason why I focus on practical issues, because one thing that I believe many Germans can still agree on is that the security situation has to be okay. And if you look at election results in the States, you will realize that those who stand for hardline domestic security policies, they win elections, no matter whether they are social democrats or conservatives.
Well, at least there's one thing, I suppose, that then cuts through to them all. But I think it's fascinating that you both highlighted in your presentations the fact that having this federal Länder system really complexifies so many different aspects of the response in terms of how many different agencies, but also how that divides politics around the country and how that impacts on both sides of the ideological coin. I'll maybe flip things around a little bit now, because we've got some very specific questions to Guido. So I'll steer a couple to you, and then I'll come Daniela and steer some of the more specific ones to you on specific groups. So one of our colleagues at ICPVTR, Nodir, who looks a lot at Central Asian jihadists, has asked a question about the Turkish Milli Görüş group. which is, of course, a group I'm sure you've heard of that is quite influential. There's been accusations that Millî Görüş has a role within the sort of rise of Islamist extremist communities within Turkey and within diaspora communities in particular. I wonder if you could talk to a little bit about that. And then also, Guido, while we have you, you mentioned in your presentation, you spoke to an individual who believes that ISIS is the Salafist Islamic State, and this has kind of mobilized, people in a really energetic way that previously we hadn't seen. And one of our colleagues is asking, did this person ever compare ISIS with Saudi Arabia or another Arab state that has a kind of Salafi outlook? And what was his distinction as to how Islamic State was being constructed and how these existing Arab states, which use some element of Salafism within their perspectives, how would they compare these two? How did they see them as distinct or not? So I think two specific questions to you, and then Daniela, I think I'll pick up a question from one of our colleagues, Kyla, who's asked some specific questions about the confusion on the extreme right in some of the cases that we're seeing. But Guido, over to you first.
Well, these are big questions. First, the one on Millî Görüş.
I know you can handle them very succinctly, I'm sure.
I'll give it a try. Millî Görüş. There have been some cases where jihadists have been in contact with Millî Görüş and like-minded individuals and so on. My impression is that there is no connection whatsoever between this group and jihadist mobilization and recruitment. In fact, I know some cases where preachers close to Millî Görüş tried their very best to keep people from joining jihadist organizations, from traveling to Syria, and so on. They are a problem. They are an Islamist organization, but of a total different kind. We have this debate that has been started by the French governments and the Austrian governments on what they call political Islam. The Austrians seem to believe that there is a difference between political Islam and Islamism, which I think is absurd. And the argumentation is that there is a continuum, and organizations like the Brotherhood, Millî Görüş, and so on, that they are building the ideological foundations for the jihadist movement. I think that's wrong. That's simply false. And we should address these phenomena in a totally different way. The Brotherhood is a political problem, perhaps an integration problem for integration policy. The jihadist movement, I think, is so small that we can deal with it as a security issue. Secondly, this stuff about Saudi Arabia. Most of the people that I talk to, they talk about the Islamic State, Sharia, and they really do not see, as I would see it, the ideological connection between Saudi Wahhabism and IS. They simply believe that the Saudi state is corrupted, it is pro-Western, and it has nothing to do whatsoever with the ideological foundations that were laid by the Wahhabi scholars in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. Although what I do see on their part is a very strong desire to go to Saudi Arabia to study. That's quite ironic. And the reason is that the very foundations of their ideology, and they know that, are being taught at one university to foreigners, and that's the Islamic University of Medina. And that is, I think, one of the most important practical problems for European, but also Middle Eastern and possibly Asian governments, is how to keep students from going there, because many of the preachers that I've talked about, and especially the most important and the most influential ones, they studied in Medina. I've mentioned Mirzad Omerovich, the famous Abu Taymah is his Maharaki, his fighting name. Mirzad Omerovich, he studied there. He got his BA And that's part of the reason why he's so influential in jihadist circles in Austria and in the Balkans until today, is the very fact that he is one of the few who managed to get a degree from the Islamic University in Medina. And afterwards, others went there in order to study as well. So they are aware of the fact that the books that you have to read in order to become an IS preacher are being taught in Medina, but they do not see any connection between Saudi Arabia nowadays and the Islamic State, and they don't talk about it.
Thank you for that, Guido. I think it's a very clear response and succinct to some big questions, I know. I'm conscious we've got about 10 minutes left. You saw quite a few questions to pack in, so I'll keep going through them all. I have kept myself out of the questioning, even though I have a number of things I'd love to ask you guys. But I wanted Daniela to turn to you and to ask a question that a colleague Kyla put, which is this one looking specifically at the case of Tobias Rathjen, which he highlights as a curious case, given it was a bit of a mishmash of ideologies. And this is something that we find in other kind of contexts as well, where you get these individuals who seem to have these kind of weird self-assembled ideologies, which aren't totally, cleanly put maybe in the extreme right bracket. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, whether this is a sort of common increasing phenomenon in Germany in particular, and how the government is trying to respond to that particular side of the threat.
It's something that we have seen recently, not just in Germany, but also in Europe more broadly. We actually had so for the ones who don't know, there is this radicalization awareness network that I've been active in for a while. It's a network of practitioners. There's a new branch now also involving policymakers. But the idea is, so there's meetings regularly on certain topics. And that was actually one of the topic of one meeting recently, this mix of ideologies. That can be seen especially in relation to right-wing extremism. And it's something that, so this individual is not an exception. This is really a phenomenon that is observable, especially online. And it goes also through things like gaming platforms, so not just social media. And it's very much increasing in intensity and reach. So this is something that we'll have to look at more carefully in the future, because it has become increasingly difficult to categorize individuals and even ideologies in one or the other category. So yeah, again, tip of the iceberg.
No, thank you for that. I think it's a hugely difficult problem, because of course these individuals are not only have these idiosyncratic ideologies, but they're completely isolated, in terms of they're not really, I mean, a lot of the groups and networks that Guido, you've been talking about, these are individuals who are sort of very clearly kind of connected up. And I think what's interesting about some of these new issues that we're seeing on the extreme right is how disconnected in some ways they are. They're connected online and they talk as part of communities, but they're not sort of maybe connected in the same way. And that's, I suppose, a distinction that we can see. I suppose what's interesting is how the complexities of managing this is still so evident in both particular cases. But Daniela, you look like you wanted to come back on something there.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to say, because I think an important point is like, there's two things. So you have this kind of mass phenomenon. I think in the US, one even talks about mass radicalization, in a different context. But basically you have all of a sudden a lot of people who start believing in, strange ideas, and you have all this, a mix of ideologies. And I think an issue we haven't really talked about yet is the influence of the pandemic and the insecurities that people have, and the decreasing confidence in the state authorities. I think this is something very important, especially in the right-wing extremist scene, or on the right, or what makes it attractive to people. Like you have, for example, this anti-COVID measures demonstrations where all of a sudden you have right-wing, left-wing extremists, esoterics, and all sorts of people all kind of coming together, thinking that, okay, maybe the right wing is not as bad as the situation where the state is doing something to us, right? So this kind of suspicion towards the state is a very good precondition for all these conspiracy theories and going towards the right wing thing. So basically you have this like mass phenomenon going on and all this like mix of ideologies. And then you will have certain individuals who become violent, right? So, and you need different kinds of policies for these different kinds of phenomena, because the question is, how can you identify these people, right? I mean, and in many cases, not just here, but also, for example, in the jihadi part, like the ones who actually go out and do terror attacks, especially recently, oftentimes they are people who are troubled in various ways. So the issue of mental health has become also very relevant recently. So these can be or tend to be in recent years particular types of existences, but on the other hand, they are, but not that isolated that nobody hears anything about them, right? So very rarely you have somebody like Anders Breivik who said was part of this big movement, but actually wasn't. However, usually there are certain people who hear something, right? And that's why it's important to have this whole of society approach where all kinds of actors are being sensitized toward this issue. Because you cannot have, it's impossible for police or intelligence to actually identify these guys. I mean, there's all sorts of solutions such as algorithms online, trying to detect messages. I mean, we even figured, okay, before they do something, they actually post certain things in a certain way and more of it. But still, you cannot really rely on this only. You have to have the human element as well. So what I'm saying is that it is, I think, possible to discover these kinds of individuals if you have this more broad approach to prevention.
Thank you for that. And you know, I'll pivot off Daniela's point to say, Guido, do you have any? What do you think of that kind of that response? And do you think that's specific to the extreme right, or do you think this is something that applies to the problems that you're talking about on the Islamist side? And what has there been any impact on COVID? Of COVID in terms of the threat picture that we're seeing on the Islamist side? And very conscious that we're coming towards the end of our time, I'm going to slip in a couple of specific questions to Guido about the Syria points that you raised in particular. And then maybe if we have time at the end, I'll ask you both the same question for your brief thoughts on financing. But I think Guido, one of our colleagues, Vidya, has asked a question about what is the German government's plan for the women and children that are stuck in Al-Hol in Syria? And also, can you briefly tell us whether more Germans joined ISIS or HTS, or what used to be known as Nusra? So a few questions for you, Guido. Let's see if you can handle them all together again.
Yeah, well, COVID, it has, well, the problem in the country is still there. We have a jihadist scene, and there have been major plots in recent years, but my impression is that the number of plots has dropped substantially since 2019. That's when I heard about the last major one against targets in Germany, and the cell is currently on trial. It's a cell of Tajiks. And the first one of them has already been convicted. So that was 2019. Ever since, I haven't seen any big stuff anymore, but might be that there was something. But my impression is that the lack of the opportunity to travel, that this has really damaged the ability of these movements to perpetrate attacks. That's my first point. Secondly, please, Raphael, what was the second question?
The second one was a bit more specific about, well, I guess I'll slip to the Syria questions. How has the government, what has the government done about the women and children that are in Al-Hol? And then did more Germans join ISIS or HTS/Nusra?
Yeah, well, more Germans joined IS. 80 to 90% of all Germans joined IS. We are talking about 60 to 100 who joined HTS, Horaz ad-Din, and other smaller groups, possibly even the TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Party. There is a German who's suspected to have joined the Uyghurs. But the point about the presence of Germans in HTS territory in Idlib, I think is twofold. When let's just forget about IS and everything that happened in recent years and take a look at the situation in 2010. We had about 20 to 30 Germans in Pakistan and Afghanistan who joined the IMU, Al-Qaeda, the IJU, and other smaller organizations. And the result were serious terrorist plots here in Germany and in other countries. We usually talk about the Euro plot. And it was the result of the presence of a relatively small number of Germans. Now we do still have about 40 Germans with HTS, Ras ad-Din, and so on in Syria. Plus, they live in an area that is virtually a Turkish protectorate, namely in Idlib, that might pose a major threat to Germany in the future. And now your question about the government's plan. The government's plan is to keep these people from German soil as long as possible. The government is aware of the fact that as long as they are German nationals, not all of them are, that will be impossible in the long run. So, and the government has been forced by the courts to accept some of the women. We are talking about 70 to 80 women, and I think up to 29 males. And so I guess that most of these women will return to Germany in the coming years. The government wants to do that in a piecemeal way so that it has, I don't know what, 2 or 3 a month. That will probably be the result. What is totally unknown is what is happening to the males. Because the biggest problem is they don't have mobile phones. If you don't have a mobile phone, you can't contact a lawyer. If you don't have a lawyer, you can't go to court in Germany. And my impression is that the German government doesn't want them back. The Trump administration tried to exert pressure by announcing that it planned to bring 2 of those to the United States. One of them, Mohammed Zammar, who was involved in the 9/11 attacks, and the second one, Yunus Emre Sakarya, the Turkish logistics guy from Cologne. I have not heard of these cases ever since the Biden administration took over. And as far as I heard, our government hasn't heard of it either. So there is no plan. There is no plan for the male terrorists in this group. But you might know that the first women are back and they are going to trial. Part of the reason why the German government is so worried about the women is that there has been an increasing number of reports that women joined a fighting unit named the Katibat Nusayba on IS territory, have received terrorist training. That's perhaps one of the reasons why our government is so hesitant. The other one is simply that all of our governments, all our 17 governments in Germany, are under pressure by right-wing populists to keep these people from German soil. I think that's the more important motive.
Well, thank you for that, Guido. And I'm very conscious that we have now gone slightly over our time. And I do like to try to keep these things compact into schedule. So I apologize that I'm going to pull the plug there and say that's, I think, enough for this particular session. Also because our wonderful speakers from Germany have gotten up very early to come and do this, and we should let them get a proper cup of coffee and really get their days going there. And I know it's coming towards the end of the day here in Singapore. And there we go. Guido's already got his, and I'm sure Daniela's aggressively caffeinated herself as well. But we've had a really rich and interesting session. And both of these two are really excellent top experts, European experts on the questions of terrorist threats within Germany. As Daniela mentioned, she has covered not only the right wing, which we asked her to focus on specifically here, but has also looked a lot at some of the Islamist threats and other issues. And I've flagged up in the chat box a couple of articles that they've recently done. And I know Guido has another article coming out soon in the same series as the Austria one that's published there, which is going to cover jihadism in Germany in particular. So I encourage everyone to go have a look at that. And I think hopefully some of the questions that we didn't get to in this session will be addressed by some of those. Thank you all very much for joining us. I have to put in a very specific plea here to those who are speakers as part of this, that you please have a go and use the feedback form, which is going to flash up after we end this. You'll see a QR code pop up, which will give you an opportunity to go to a feedback form. Please have a look at that and fill it in. It's really useful and important for us to get a sense of how the event has gone, and it really helps with, you know, giving us some metrics as to how these things are handled. So thank you very much for doing that in advance. We are planning to continue this series. We haven't got the exact date locked down on the next one, but it's probably looking at either France or Poland. We've got some really good speakers lined up for that. But before we pull the plug here, we need to thank once again Daniela and Guido. Thank you so much for joining us. If you were in person, we would give you a rapturous round of applause. And all we can do is do it remotely, and very much hope that we'll see you both soon in Singapore, or that our paths may cross somewhere else. So thank you all very much. And thank you to all our participants. And I'm looking forward to our next session. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.